Good evening. Thank you for tuning in to Lessons of Vietnam show. Here we try to tell the real truth about what went on with the Vietnam War and the men and women who were involved. Uh, we tried to dispel all the mistruths and misunderstandings that are out there, which is numerous. My name is Bill Dixon, Vietnam veteran, 1967, 1968, Tet offensive survivor. I was in a 159 engineer group, headquarters company out of Long Binh. At the time, I think it was the largest military installation in the world. It was a big place. Also, the home of the infamous LBJ, Long Binh Jail, a place you didn't want to be. We are broadcasting, as always, here from the studios of Amnon Nissan Communications. Amnon at the control board, try to keep me halfway straight, the best it can do. Again, if you'd like to participate, give us a call, as you see there on the screen, 919-518-9773, or go on Skype and go to Computers 2K Voice and participate in the show. Give us your comments, whatever else you'd like to say. That's what we're out there for. If you just want to sit back and enjoy the show, that's great too. Our show tonight is the Vietnam War and the dubious politics, or as we also say, the dubious politicians. You can see there the Veterans Crisis Line. If you're a veteran in crisis or concerned about one, touch base on one of these numbers and the text, or if you're hard of hearing or if hearing impaired, use that one. But just reach out there and get some help, or if you have a veteran, help them get some help. Okay. As I said, tonight's show is Vietnam War and dubious politics. The whole war of Vietnam was basically more about a political war as you can get. The first story I'm going to tell you about is a lost chance for peace in Vietnam. Everybody knows that the catchword for President Nixon was peace with honor. Unfortunately, he never reached that thing. But this one, we're going to go back into early on. Perhaps no question hovers more ominously over the history of the Vietnam War in 1967 than this. If the United States and its Vietnamese adversaries had been able to hammer out an acceptable peace deal before the escalation of the 1968 Tet Offensive, hundreds of thousands of lives would have been saved. Was such a peace possible? Yes, it was possible. It was maybe stretched possible a little bit, but sure would have been made Tet a whole lot nicer when I was there. Okay. Now, as you can see in the picture there up top, we have North Vietnam, and then we have Russia, and we have China. They were all working together with some other smaller countries. Cuba was involved and so forth. Then you see down below the colors of South Vietnam and the United States. For years, pundits and policymakers have speculated on this possibility. It's kind of like hindsight is so much easier to come up with, isn't it? Solve the problems. Many argue that the escalation was irreversible, that the adversary's collective fate, as it were, was sealed. But recent studies have pointed in a different direction. In other words, a lot of the information about the Vietnam War has been declassified now. The prospects of peace were arguably brighter than once thought. Okay. One approach came tantalizing close to success: the secret talks between Washington and Hanoi that began in June 1967, codenamed Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania began with two French scientists, Markovitch and Albrock, approached Henry Kissinger, then a Harvard professor, to offer their services to go between to promote negotiations between the United States and North Vietnam. Kissinger had worked as a consultant on the war for the Johnson administration, and was eager to do anything he could to ingratiate himself with the president. You can see there Johnson and the peace thing in his hand, holding the bombing stuff, and Ho Chi Minh is squatting down there. So Albrecht was also an old friend of Ho Chi Minh and promised to deliver a message to the aging leader if President Johnson had anything new to say. Kissinger referred the proposal to Secretary of State Dean Rusk, that's him there, with a copy of Defense Secretary Robert McNamara. McNamara, of course, took the lead. McNamara's ego wouldn't let anybody else take the lead. Little uh, editorial there, and took the lead in diplomacy during Pennsylvania. Already committed to find a negotiated way out of Vietnam, which is strange since he put us in there. He pushed Pennsylvania vigorously at a meeting with President Johnson and his key advisors. Johnson was skeptical about any negotiation with the communists, however, dismissing the French proposal as just another of those blind alleys that lead nowhere. But McNamara persisted, and eventually the president relented and allowing his defense secretary to establish contact through Markovich and Albrecht with view to future peace negotiations, as long as they did nothing to embarrass the United States. See, these were secret talks. Nobody told the Pentagon. Nobody told our allies in South Vietnam or anybody else. This was strictly between Johnson, McNamara, the two French gentlemen, and Hanoi. So you can see the line between Washington, D.C. and Hanoi there. In early July, Markovich and Albrecht traveled to Hanoi and presented the Johnson administration's so-called Phase A, Phase B proposal to the Hanoi leadership. The United States would stop its bombing campaign in return for a confidential assurance from Hanoi that would halt its infiltration into key areas of South Vietnam. Wouldn't have to be signed, just say a gentleman's thing was, we'll do it. Once North Vietnam acted, the United States would freeze its combat forces at existing levels and peace talks could begin. Now, this was just right after the first buildup. So we're talking about 67, 68 here. Okay. This was a significant departure from Johnson's previous insistence on mutual de-escalation. The president took the gamble, hoping to placate liberals in Congress and anti-war protesters who were already planning a huge rally in Washington for that October. Johnson could always resume bombing if nothing materialized from the contact. The initial results of Pennsylvania appeared promising. Albrecht and Markovich arrived in Hanoi on July 24, 1967, and met with Ho Chi Minh, who by that time was getting a little older and was no longer actually the man in charge. The Prime Minister, Pham Dang Dong, was actually the man that's in charge at the time. Ho's visit with the two scientists was largely ceremonial, but the meeting with Dong was substantive and productive. Dong insisted that North Vietnam could not negotiate while it was being bombed. But he also surprisingly indicated that Hanoi would not require the United States to announce the bombing pause publicly. In other words, we're going to keep it secret. You quit bombing us and we won't tell anybody, saving Johnson from a potential political problem. If the bombing stopped, Dong assured his guests negotiations begun immediately. A wary Johnson decided to move ahead with a bombing pause without consulting his South Vietnamese allies or his military command to get negotiations started. In other words, those of us who were in South Vietnam at the time, we didn't realize there was a bombing slowdown. The South Vietnamese government didn't know there was one. The Pentagon didn't know there was one. Again, it was one of those secret things. Okay. There, as you can see, one of the little bomb craters, bomb shelters they had in Hanoi, kind of a pipe in the ground, and if the air raid was sound, they would jump down wherever they were out doing their thing, or jump down in the little bomb shelter there. He authorized Kissinger to have Albrecht and Markovich tell the North Vietnamese leadership that there would be an additional bombing halt around Hanoi for a period of 10 days, beginning August 24th. The next scheduled visit of the two French scientists. Okay, let me go over that because that's going to be important. Johnson told North Vietnam that he would stop the bombing around Hanoi for 10 days. Okay. Hanoi agreed that this was a productive change in the United States' position and positive outcome of the Pennsylvania contact. For the first time in years, it appeared that the two sides were serious about negotiations. Chet Cooper, an aide to W. Averill Harriman, that's Harriman you picture there, John's peace ambassador, called Pennsylvania the last best chance for peace, knowing that war was likely to escalate otherwise. And again, remember, Congress, the Pentagon, or South Vietnam, anybody knew about these talks. On the day that Albrecht and McNamaras were to leave for Paris for Hanoi, United States aircraft flew more than 200 sorties against North Vietnam, more than any other previous day in the war. What happened to those 10 days? The official explanation for the poor timing of the bombing mission was that the attacks had already been scheduled for early in the month, but had been delayed by bad weather. Once the weather broke on August 20th, the bombing resumed according to protocol and lasted 4 days. Hanoi, can you believe they were upset? Hanoi publicized the new attacks, claiming that Johnson had used the proposed bombing pause as a diversion while he actually escalated the war. Johnson, of course, denounced those claims, but he could not hide the fact that he had indeed approved an escalation to the bombing just 2 days before it began on August 10th, and he had used the weather delay as a convenient cover for his actions. Perhaps the president believed that the United States had hit all available targets before the pause in case it did not get another chance. Johnson even approved one target on the ground that if it talks with Hanoi materializes, he would not want to approve the site later. In other words, let's go ahead and bomb it now because once we talk, we may not be able to bomb it. All along, Johnson had been skeptical along the Pennsylvania contact. He claimed later that the United States should never have held back on the bombing just because two professors were meeting. Johnson was absolutely certain that the bombing was hurting the North Vietnamese and wanted to keep pouring the steel on. In other words, he wanted to hurt the North Vietnamese more than he wanted to have peace. Okay? But Johnson never considered how increasing bombing raids would play in Hanoi. And that says much about how American leaders went to war in Vietnam. In other words, you have success laying on the table and you have failure. And the bombing of North Vietnam was pretty much took care of the word success. You can throw that away. Even after dozens of failed secret peace contacts before Pennsylvania, the Johnson administration could not see that an apparent escalation in bombing on the eve of a possible peace mission was not a formula for diplomatic success. And you go back to once they finally met in Paris, the Paris peace talks got started, how the North Vietnam was a little reluctant to, argue over the table and everything else because they had tried it one time and kind of got slapped beside the head by Johnson administration. The bombing raids not only killed the secret peace talks, but also played directly in the hands of the hardliners on the military commission, the political bureau in Hanoi. In other words, the hardliners wanted to escalate the war from their part, who had consistently argued against negotiations of any kind. Rejecting the views of some of the foreign ministers, Hanoi's hawks now had all the evidence they needed that the United States was not serious about negotiations. And that signpost kind of gives you an idea of the whole situation. Confused, unsure, unclear, perplexed, disoriented, bewildered. That's kind of how the whole United States political situation was at the time. The top North Vietnamese leadership concluded that North Vietnam had no choice but to endure the bombing while simultaneously trying to erode Washington's ability to remain in South Vietnam. See, they knew what the war protesters were doing. They knew that the people were rioting in the streets and so forth. Very probably they were also funding a lot of the protests and so forth going on. North Vietnam increased its infiltration to South Vietnam in preparation for a major escalation of the war in early 1968, which those of us who were there at that time know it as the Tet Offensive of 1968, where they were going to attack all the major bases there, and the South Vietnamese people who hated Americans and South Vietnamese government but loved communism were going to jump up and say, yes, let's go fight with the communists, which never happened. General William Westmoreland sensed this buildup and asked Johnson to increase United States troop levels in Vietnam. The number of Americans fighting in Vietnam rose to over $500,000 just a few months after Pennsylvania's failure. The talks failed because political and military leaders in Washington and Hanoi were afraid to take a chance on peace. Again, you got to remember the military who was fighting the war, they knew nothing about this peace. Hardliners in Hanoi won the day after Pennsylvania's collapse. They pushed for a quick military escalation in South Vietnam, erroneously believing that the planned Tet Offensive would lead to the general uprising that we just talked about that would topple the Saigon government and force the United States to withdraw of its troops. Because North Vietnam started believing in its own propaganda. And the people were going to rise up, which didn't happen. Used to be back then there was a say, hey, LBJ, how many kids you killed today? And you can see the lady holding up it almost looks like a diaper. How many kids will you kill today, Mr. President? Johnson is a war criminal. Johnson, in contrast, was desperately trying to keep his options open by escalating the bombing just before he paused. But in the end, he actually narrowed his choices. After he started the bombing, he didn't have much choice but to keep right on escalating. Trying to placate both anti-war members of Congress and his generals who wanted a wider war, Johnson tried to find a middle ground when there was none. Maybe that middle ground was to not bomb for those 10 days. There was no middle ground. He never fully committed to negotiations and believing that the war had to be fought with cost and risk in mind, unsuccessfully juggled competing interests and ideas. He had his special thing going there was the kind of like the New Deal situation. He was very big into social endeavors here in the United States and so forth, more as much as war. Okay? Of course, Johnson also never consulted his allies in Saigon about the secret peace talks, which would have added a dimension of complexity to any agreement. In other words, if you don't tell them about it, they won't know about it until it's too late to do anything about it. Ironically, excuse me, if I sound a little strange, like I'm in a barrel today, I have found me a cold, and it's doing strange things to my voice. So if I run into a coughing spell later and cough in your ear, I'm sorry. I'll try to warn you. Ironically, within 9 months of Pennsylvania's failure, the United States was engaged in negotiation with North Vietnam and the National Liberation Front, which was the VC, also known as the Viet Cong. They would eventually lead to unilateral American military withdrawal and a ceasefire in 1973 that allowed 10 infantry units of the North Vietnamese Army to stay in Vietnam. In other words, we pulled out, but North Vietnam did not have to pull out of South Vietnam. Isn't that a great negotiating there? Paris peace talks began in 1968, intended to establish peace in Vietnam. And you can go onto that website that's showing you there, and you can read more about it. The failure of the last best chance for peace shaped the war from years to come. What if Johnson had followed through? What if it actually ended up talking with Hanoi and later bringing in South Vietnam and the generals and so forth? Okay. That one's gone now. So let's talk about Mr. McNamara. Mr. McNamara, who ran the war. Mr. McNamara, who, along with Johnson, said there was nothing to be bombed, and the American military couldn't do nothing without his approval. In other words, what was a safe village, what was a safe area, what could be bombed, what couldn't be bombed, was all handled by them in Washington, D.C., not by the military on the ground. Let's talk about Mr. McNamara here. Robert Strange McNamara. And I can't think of a better name, middle name, than Robert Strange McNamara. Was an American business executive and the 8th United States Secretary of Defense, serving from 1961 to 1968 under Presidents Johnson, John F. Kennedy, and Lyndon B. Johnson. See, Kennedy had this thing about the Pentagon. They didn't get along very well, and Kennedy felt that the Pentagon did him a number and screwed him over when it come to the Bay of Pigs. Now, you young viewers out there, look up Bay of Pigs. That goes back to when Castro came into effect in Cuba. But he hired the whiz kids. He decided the best people to run the war were the smartest men in the United States. We're going to run it like a business, okay? Which is where McNamara came from. He was running Ford Motor Company. He played a major role in escalating the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War. Boy, did he ever. Okay. McNamara was responsible for the institution of systems analysis and public policy, which developed into a discipline known today as policy analysis. In other words, instead of worrying about what the men on the ground were doing, he sat down with his charts and everything and figured out, in theory, how the war should be fought and how the war was going to be won. The only problem was he'd never been in a war, but his theory he thought was sound because, after all, he was one of the whiz kids and one of the smartest men in the world. So theory had to work better than reality. Kind of gives you an idea of how the war went. Okay. Kennedy did not trust the Pentagon, so he brought in the whiz kids. Robert S. McNamara, you can see there he is with Kennedy. Robert, Secretary of Defense, Kennedy and Johnson administration, use of mathematical models to calculate required military forces in Vietnam. And how did that work out for you, Mr. McNamara? Well, it didn't work out pretty well for you, but it didn't work out very well for the men and women that were there. Attempted to avoid escalation of the war by putting restrictions on military operations. In other words, we can't go into Laos. We can't go into Cambodia. We can only bomb certain things. The rules of engagement. We're going to escalate the war by letting the bad guys have places that we can't touch them. We're going to keep from escalating the war is that we fly over a MiG base. Unless those planes are in the air, we can't bomb them. We have to wait till they get in the air to shoot at them so they can shoot back at us. That was his whiz kid ideas. Okay. President John F. Kennedy tapped him to become his Secretary of Defense, looking to him to reorganize the country's defense program. McNamara officially took over the post in January 1961, and his main job was to improve how the Pentagon operated. McNamara helped establish planning and budgeting systems. To revitalize the military, he emphasized the need for traditional troops and military hardware, as well as improved weapons systems. The country had to be prepared for conventional and unconventional war, including guerrilla warfare. As much as any individual, Secretary of Defense Robert S. McNamara personified the American commitment to Vietnam. He was a can-do man, the can-do society in the can-do era. Okay. David Halberson wrote in his book, The Best and the Brightest, and during the Kennedy and early Johnson years, he managed America's expanding involvement almost if he were a desk officer that we're talking about now, Mr. McNamara. Whether slogging through Vietnam and Army fatigues, spewing out statistics to demonstrate progress, or presiding at a press conference, map on the wall, pointer in hand, he epitomized, yes, epitomized, that's what I was trying to say, what came to be called as McNamara's War. Whatever the difficulties of the moment, he exuded a certainty that promised ultimate success. In other words, if he came up with it, he knew it had to be right. Now, everybody knows that we got involved in full-time war in Vietnam because of the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which was in August 1964, where North Vietnamese gunships fired on the U.S. ships, the USS Maddox. However, later during and you can see the Gulf of Tonkin up there, we had ships in the Gulf of Tonkin. And I would say it's kind of like having the Russians or the Chinese having ships off the coast of Wilmington, North Carolina. It would probably upset us a bit. So we had ships there. Later during the Johnson administration, McNamara backed the escalation of U.S. involvement after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which in 1964, during which U.S. ships were allegedly attacked by the communist North Vietnamese, an event later proven to have never happened. It has been assumed that the Tonkin Gulf incident was a deception by President Lyndon Johnson to justify a war in Vietnam. The 4th of August 1964 bombings of North Vietnam began by American bombers in retaliation for a non-existing naval attack by North Vietnam on American naval vessels that brought about the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Was not a move by Johnson to get the American people in support of the war, American war in Vietnam. Okay, I want to make sure you read that to you again. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution was not a move by Johnson to get the American people to support an American war in Vietnam. There's a reason I wanted to read that to you, because in just a minute it's going to make a whole lot of difference. There was an attack 2 days before. There was some firing between United States ships and some gunships, but on that particular day, August 4th, nothing happened, but we'll talk about that in just a moment. That day, the real deception was that Secretary of Defense Robert Strange McNamara, misleading President Johnson by withholding from him the information the United States Command in Gulf of Tonkin, who had initially reported an attack on North Vietnamese patrol boats on U.S. warships, had now expressed serious doubts about the initial reports and had called for a full investigation when it got light. In other words, the commander out there on site says, maybe that didn't happen. I know Admiral Stockdale, who later became Admiral, was also a POW, and he was flying above at that situation time, and his quote was, "What the hell are they shooting at?" So McNamara didn't tell that to Johnson. And to make matters worse, that withholding information represented a brazen move to usurp the constitutional power of the decision on the use of military force by President Johnson. Guess who ordered the bombing? Robert Strange McNamara, not President Johnson, ordered the bombing. As you can see, they had a ghost North Vietnamese patrol boats out there that were supposed to be gun. Johnson did not order the bombing of North Vietnam to start the war. In fact, it was Mr. Robert Strange McNamara ordered the bombing, which I didn't think he could do. But I guess when you work speaking for the president, you can get about anything. McNamara proceeded on his own to issue the strike order without consulting with President Johnson about what he had learned from the U.S. commander in the Gulf, thus depriving the president of the choice of canceling the retaliatory strike before an investigation could reveal the truth. If the people lie to the government, it's a felony. But if the government lied to people, it's just politics. McNamara's deception is documented in the declassified files on the Gulf of Tonkin episode in the Lyndon Johnson library. See, we had a war where we lost 58,300 and some men and women there on the site, all because of Robert Strange McNamara took it upon himself to call in an airstrike. Now you understand what I talked about, the dubious politics. Support of the North Vietnamese was the Viet Cong, a militant communist group that opposed the U.S.-backed government in South Vietnam. After the World War II, when the French left, they had been fighting the Viet Minh. The Viet Minh will later become the Vietnamese, or we call them Vietnamese communists. They were fighting, and then North Vietnam, who said they weren't involved at all, was actually furnishing them everything. But then North Vietnam came in to the war also. Employing guerrilla warfare tactics, the group began engaging in more military actions in 1965. In response, the United States advanced the conflict in Vietnam by the use of extensive bombing in the north and by deploying troops in the south, which is what we just discussed almost a moment ago. Okay? Towards the end of his life, former Defense Secretary Robert McNamara issued a string of candid mea culpas for misjudgments about Vietnam that were made during the 61-68 tenure at the Pentagon, especially his delay in acting on growing doubts that the war could be won. In other words, he went, oops, can we get a do-over? Didn't seem to work. You don't get do-overs with people's lives. I'm very sorry that in the process of accomplishing things, I've made errors. Yeah, you think he made errors, huh? McNamara said in Fog of War, that's his book, an Oscar-winning 2003 documentary, while he never issued a formal apology for his role in the quagmire, McNamara, who died in July of 2009 at age 93, made clear he was haunted by the blunders made under his watch that cost the lives of thousands of U.S. troops. All he could come up was, I'm sorry. Oops. Okay. In 1967, McNamara ordered a study of the U.S. role in Indochina, which was later leaked into the press and published as the Pentagon Papers, which created a real stir. The study covered from World War II into 1968 and contained many revelations about the events and extent of the U.S. involvement in Vietnam during several administrations dating back to Harry S. Truman when he was president. One notable discovery was that Johnson had U.S. forces engaged in covert warfare against North Vietnam in 1964. Okay? That was long before we were there. Now, this is a book, and one of his books he came out with in retrospect, and this was left at the wall, and by a gentleman who was wounded 9 times. So if you look at the picture there, there's 9 bullet holes in the book. That kind of gives you the idea of what he felt about McNamara and his in retrospect. He was wounded, as you can see, whether you can read the notes or not there, but he said he was wounded 9 times, so he shot the book 9 times. So this is what Mr. McNamara had to say. We were wrong, terribly wrong. We owe it to future generations to explain why. McNamara, writing in his 1995 memoir, in retrospect, on the management of the Vietnam War. Where's this we, Kemosabe? The only person I can see was wrong was you were the running the war. You were Mr. McNamara running the war, McNamara's war. And now you says, we were wrong, terribly wrong. We owe it to future generations. How about the 58,000 and some odd men and women who died over there who don't have future generations? Okay? In 1968, President Nixon promises peace with honor. With President Johnson not running for re-election in 1968, the nation elects Richard Nixon. President Nixon promised the American people peace with honor. Okay, we're not even going to go into how much honor he had, and right now we're going to talk about it a little bit later. National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger offered a plan to end American involvement with Vietnamization. In other words, they were going to take over the Vietnamese. South Vietnamese going to take over. This plan called for gradual withdrawal of troops and increased participation of South Vietnamese. Now, the peace talks had started while Johnson was still in president. But Nixon went to South Vietnam and told the South Vietnamese people, government, listen, don't agree on a peace account while Johnson's in office. Wait till I get in office because I get you a better deal. So he prolonged the war there. He was going to get the South Vietnamese a better deal with honor. Okay. Richard Nixon always denied it. President Lyndon Johnson had strong suspicions and the most calls for outrage of the rumored treachery. My God, I would never do anything to encourage the South Vietnam not to come to the peace table, Nixon told Johnson in a conversation captured on the White House taping system. Yeah, okay. Now we know Nixon lied. Well, Nixon lied a whole lot. Recently found notes left by H.R. Haldeman, Nixon's closest aide, showed that Nixon had direct efforts to scuttle the peace talks. Nixon feared it could give Vice President Hubert Humphrey, his opponent in the presidential race, an edge on the 1968 elections. U.S.-Saigon rift on talks widens. Relations are strained. Anti-Americanisms among politicians increase. On October 22nd, 1968, he directed Haldeman to monkey wrench the peace talks. And this is the man who was later going to come up with peace with honor. Richard Nixon sabotaged the Vietnam peace talks to give himself a better chance in the 1968 U.S. presidential election, prolonging the war by 5 years. How many American men and women died with that extra 5 years so that he could win an election? When the Paris Peace Accords, negotiated by the Nixon administration and the Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, brought to the long and torturous Vietnam War to an apparent end, North and South Vietnam were supposed to remain separate states like the two Koreas. And Nixon was able to withdraw U.S. forces while proclaiming peace with honor. Yet the agreement was, as one interviewee notes, a masterpiece of ambiguity. And you see there the Paris peace talks, and he's dragging along, the U.S. is dragging along the Saigon regime. And the note up there in the cartoon says, boy, if he only had put up that kind of resistance in Vietnam. The agreement on the end of the war, restoring peace in Vietnam, signed January 27th, 1973. From the very beginning, never looked like it would live up to its name. This is a book by Larry Berman, who I have met in the past. Nixon, Kissinger, and Betrayal in Vietnam, No Peace, No Honor. You ought to get the book and read it. Nixon sacrificed the lives of American soldiers to further his electoral ends. The contrast between the public image Nixon created and reality shown by the secret recorded tapes is almost unbelievable. See, one of the things that got him later into trouble is because everything that went on in the White House was recorded, except his secretary lost, I think it was about 15 minutes that suddenly disappeared of tapes, which was also very interesting going on at the time, but okay. The president of South Vietnam, in whose defense more than 50,000 Americans gave their lives, wept upon hearing President Nixon's proposed settlement terms. Hanoi released American prisoners of war and agreed that the South could choose its government by free elections. But the Accords threw the voting process to a commission that could only act unanimity and in secret. All but impossible to achieve among communists and anti-communists who spent years shooting out their differences. In other words, all the South Vietnamese or the North Vietnamese people who were left in South Vietnam after the war, after the peace talks, that they didn't have to leave. Now all of a sudden they could help decide about the government of South Vietnam because they were not told to leave. But that kind of gives you the picture. That kind of gives you the idea of the American soldiers who lost their lives while Nixon was playing games with his Vietnamization, which we're going to talk about. Okay. Worse, Nixon would leave North Vietnamese troops occupying and controlling much of the South, while withdrawing all remaining American ground forces. Some of you know that since the war, several of us have been back 3 different times. We built some playground for some orphanages over there. And one of the last ones was in Dong Ha, South Vietnam. You can go online on one of the on-demand shows, and you can watch that. We filmed a show from South Vietnam at the orphanage there with the kids playing on the playground. That was one of the areas that was actually left controlled by the North Vietnam when the Americans pulled out. It is only an agonizing solution, said President Thu, and sooner or later the government will crumble. This is the Prime Minister of South Vietnam. National Security Advisor Henry A. Kissinger reported Thu's response to Nixon on October 6, 1972, adding, "I also think that Thu is right, that our terms will eventually destroy him." Now let's talk about a little bit how we got there. Vietnamization. Nixon talked so much about Vietnamization. Nixon promised America peace with honor via a strategy of Vietnamization and negotiation. Vietnamization, he said, would train and equip the South Vietnamese to defend themselves without American troops. He realized it couldn't. South Vietnam probably can never even survive anyway, said the president on tape. Never said that out in public. But going back to listen to some of his secret tapes, he did say that. On his first full day in office, he'd asked military, diplomatic, and intelligence officers how soon the South would be able to handle communists on its own. Their answer was unanimous. Never. And then he started his Vietnamization. Pull out. There he is, that resolve he's got there. Nixon faced a stark choice: continue sending Americans to fight and die in South Vietnam's defense for the foreseeable future, or bring the troops home knowing that without them, Saigon would ultimately fall. There was no way he could sell either option: endless war or withdrawal followed by a defeat, as a peace with honor he promised. So he lied. Duh. Nixon said the day the South Vietnamese people can take over their own defense is in sight. Our goal is total American withdrawal from Vietnam. We can and we will reach that goal through our program of Vietnamization. And he stood up before the American people straight-faced and told us that. To make Vietnamization look successful, he spaced withdrawals out across 4 years, gradually reducing the number of American soldiers in Vietnam from over 500,000 in January 1969 to less than 50,000 by Election Day 1972. It was important to get them out before Election Day. I wonder why. Well, you can figure that out. Okay? There he is with his fingers up in his peace signs. Throughout those 4 years, he made many national televised speeches to announce partial troop withdrawals, claiming each one proved Vietnamization was working. And then along came Watergate. That's the Watergate Hotel, by the way. That's a nice hotel. We used to stay quite a bit in the hotel across the street from that and used to go over and get drinks and so forth because they had a nice little grocery. 5 men broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters in Washington, setting off a series of actions that brought down Republican President Richard Nixon. What became known as the Watergate scandal uncovered an intricate trail of wrongdoing that went all the way to the White House. The burglary and insurance scandal led to the only resignation of a U.S. president and changed American politics. Nixon resigns. He urges a time of healing along with his peace of honor. Ford will take office today. Now, that also brings up an interesting situation. How Ford got to be president. In fact, how he got to be vice president is interesting. President Nixon became the first president to resign from office. His vice president, Spiro Agnew, had already resigned due to corruption charges. So the vice president was corrupt, politician corrupt. I know it shocks you out there, but he resigned, and then Gerald Ford took over as vice president. And then along comes Nixon, and he resigns. Gerald Ford now becomes president. Gerald Ford, the replacement vice president, became the replacement president. Okay? And one of history's bitter ironies, peace was maintained for a while because the North Vietnamese considered Nixon insane enough to attack them again if they broke the peace agreements. In other words, as long as Nixon was in office, they knew they couldn't break the peace treaty because they felt that Nixon was crazy enough to come back and start bombing them again. So, the Watergate scandal. Vice President Spiro Agnew resigns due to conviction for bribes. Gerald Ford appointed vice president. New special prosecutor named Leon Jaworski. Special prosecutor. They've seemed to like those since then. Jaworski also demanded recordings. Nixon forced by court to turn over all the tapes, except for that mysterious 15 minutes. House and Judiciary Committee voted to impeach Nixon. Nixon resigned. Ford now president. There he is, Ford smoking his pipe. Really nice guy. Once the president was deposed by the Watergate scandal in late 1974, the North Vietnamese Communists carried out several small actions after America gave them a response. In other words, Nixon was gone. Now let's go out and attack a little bit. And nothing happened. They went out a little bit bigger. And nothing happened. And they went out again and nothing happened. Okay? So then we came along with the Eastertide offensive that we've talked about before. The North Vietnamese Communists carried out several small actions after America, and then nothing happened. By spring of 1975, their troops were pouring across the South with Russian and Chinese supplies. The new administration of Gerald Ford gave no sign of returning America to the war. This was due to, and that's the North Vietnamese coming across the border on the tanks. U.S. Congress undercuts peace. 9th of June, 1973, U.S. Congress passes the Case Church Amendment, which forbids any further U.S. military involvement in Southeast Asia. Effective August 15th, 1973, this veto-proof vote is 278 to 124 in the House and 64 to 26 in the Senate. The amendment paves the way for North Vietnam to wage yet another invasion of the South, this time without fear of U.S. bombings. Today, we've been talking about North Vietnam having nuclear bombs. And we're committed to go in and help South Korea. But see, at that time, we had the same relationships with South Vietnam as we have with South Korea today. But Congress made it impossible for us to do anything at all to help our ally in Southeast Asia and South Vietnam. This meant no food, weapons, medical supplies, no planes, helicopters, tanks, or replacement parts. American planes or ships were prohibited from being anywhere in Southeast Asia. They couldn't even fly over, as well as personnel. Nothing could go to South Vietnam. His true lawmakers gave South Vietnam less than Nixon and later President Gerald R. Ford requested, but lawmakers could have doubled or tripled aid to Saigon, and it would still have collapsed under Nixon's settlement terms. In other words, his peaceful honor wasn't honorable to anybody but maybe North Vietnamese in the Congress. And before he left office, Nixon's the one that proposed that amendment who said we couldn't help in limited amount. As the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Pentagon, CIA, State Department, and General Abrams, who took over out of their Westmoreland, pointed out to Nixon shortly after he took office, the South Vietnamese couldn't handle the commerce without the combat support of major U.S. ground forces. Nixon had withdrawn all American troops under the terms of the peace accords. That was Hanoi's price for freedom, American POWs. In other words, we'll pull out if you let the POWs go by election time. Later, after he was successfully reelected and could afford to let Saigon fall. Without U.S. ground forces, Saigon was doomed, even if by some miracle it received unlimited American aid. Complaining about aid cuts allowed Nixon to evade the truth about his exit strategy. Basically, there was no exit strategy. Rather than negotiate a safe exodus for South Vietnamese who had fought on the American side of the war, he left them to either die in combat or live under communist rule. In other words, Nixon sold out South Vietnamese people and South Vietnamese government, and the American Congress put a stamp on it. Ford tried to persuade Congress to vote a measly $722 million to at least help him out, what Kissinger called the final agony of South Vietnam. Yet even the staunchest right-wingers in Congress were anti-war by then. All the people who supported the war all of a sudden was against the war. It's like somebody said one time, I voted for it before I was against it. I think a guy named John said that. Whatever one's political leanings, it's hard now to see this dereliction responsibility as nothing but shameful. Members of Congress got up and walked out of Gerald Ford during that speech, asking him for $722 million to give them food and medicine and so forth to the South Vietnamese people. And while making evacuation plans would have seemed the natural course of action at this point, it is not the one pursued by U.S. Ambassador Graham Martin, a North Carolinian who simply couldn't believe that disaster was imminent upon his was being just thrown upon him, that the thing was going to fall. He just could not believe that South Vietnam was going to fall. He was the ambassador in Saigon at the time. Okay. As the communist forces closed in, helicopters were considered the least desirable mode of escape. In other words, let's get all the Americans out by airplanes, because helicopters can't fly as far. Well, evidently, they told the communists, because North Vietnamese communists, you see them there attacking Tan Son Nhut Air Base, which is there in Saigon. So there was holes in the runway. So the last plane out finally left, and no other planes could come in because of holes blown in the runway. In Saigon, there remained several thousand Americans, including contractors, newsmen, security, and diplomatic personnel. And see, the ambassador never said we need to pull out. He kept staying there and staying there, and now the bad guys are at the gate. As the collapse of the South unfolded, many of these folks were grew increasingly worried about their South Vietnamese friends, colleagues, and family members. Now, the reason I have the picture of Bing Crosby singing White Christmas, that was a secret song. When the Americans heard Bing Crosby singing White Christmas in Vietnam at about 100 degrees, that was their time. They were supposed to beat their way just as fast as they could to the embassy. But he waited almost too long. With only 24 hours to pull it off, Washington ordered Ambassador Martin to be on the first helicopter out, but he refused and stayed to supervise the perilous evacuation, leaving on one of the last choppers. Now, the picture there you see is the American embassy, or was the American embassy. It no longer stands. It has been torn down. But the famous picture that all of you are thinking it's the last helicopter leaving from the American embassy is that one. That is not the American embassy. That building still stands today. I took a picture of it the last time I was in Vietnam. That was actually the CIA headquarters on the compound. See people getting on. You see outside that the South Vietnamese who were promised, the secretaries, the South Vietnamese people who work for Americans there were trying any way they could to climb over the fence and leave. The Americans promised the Vietnamese they had worked for the United States that they would all be airlifted to safety. That was back when the airports worked, but ended up leaving 420 plus behind, a failure presented as symbolic of Americans' whole history in Vietnam. I remember seeing that picture and going, what was all that time I was there for? Why all these people died for this mob rule? All of a sudden, just get out the best way you can and so forth. Had Nixon remained in office, he would have been able to claim that he coulda, woulda, shoulda intervened with the American air power to save South Vietnam, if only Congress hadn't tied his hands with the amendment. Of course, he came up with the amendment to start with. The secret assurance he gave to China and Russia, important here, the secret assurance that he gave China and Russia that he would not intervene remained classified until long after Nixon was dead. In other words, you remember that North Vietnamese was afraid to attack while he was in office because he was crazy enough to bomb them? Well, he had already told the allies for North Vietnam that he wasn't going to come back in. Could the South Vietnamese have won the war or obtained a ceasefire like North and South Korea have? Nixon and Kissinger's peace with honor allowed communist North Vietnamese to remain in South Vietnam. As Russia and China are pouring military arms, food, medical supplies, tanks, helicopters, airplanes, technology, and anything North Vietnam needed, yes, Congress passes the Case-Church Amendment, which forbids any further U.S. military involvement in any kind of Southeast Asia. The United States Congress, McNamara, Nixon, and Kissinger not only lost the Vietnam War, they lost the country of South Vietnam. Whatever could have been or should have been matter. What if the American people also had known the truth about the Gulf of Tonkin? What if they really knew that it didn't happen? What if they knew that Johnson was not the one that ordered the bombing? That President Johnson had thrown away the original peace talks? That Robert McNamara and Johnson ran the war from Washington, D.C.? That Robert McNamara had been straight with Johnson with his victory opinion. He early on decided it could not happen, but he never told Johnson or the American people. There was no plan of victory, what victory looked like. Nixon would not have sabotaged the peace talks. What if Nixon and Kissinger had not sold out the South Vietnamese? What if a peace treaty had not allowed North Vietnam to keep soldiers inside South Vietnam? What if Vietnamization had time to work? What if Watergate had not forced Nixon to resign? What if Congress had not passed the Case-Church Amendment? What if Congress had supported financially our ally South Vietnam just like other allies? Vietnam, good soldiers betrayed by gutless politicians. There was right at 3 million, a little less than 3 million men and women who served in Vietnam. I'm one of them. I'm proud of what I did there. But I tell you, every time I see my South Vietnamese friends, as thankful they're always coming up, thank you for fighting for our country. I am embarrassed. I'm embarrassed that the politicians did what they did. I think we could have won the war, done properly, but we didn't. So we move on. But the politicians sold us all out, South Vietnamese people, South Vietnamese country, and those of us who fought in the war. But thank you for watching the show tonight. I hope you got some value out of it. I hope you enjoyed the information. I hope you got mad at some of the information I gave you. If you want to see the show again or tell some of your friends about it, just log on to www.nissancommunications.com/live. And you saw all that, and select on demand show and which one you want to see and watch it. Tell all your friends about it. If you like the show, be sure and tell your friends. If you didn't like the show, call the number or call me and let us know so we can know what we got to do to make it better. Our next show will be again at 8 o'clock on October 24th, and it's going to be a little lighter, maybe a little bit, and it's going to be called Vietnam in Short Stories. If you are in the path of the Hurricane Michael that's out there now, please be safe. Looking forward to seeing all of you back on October 24th. I'll say I was reminded of telling everybody this Sunday in Wake Forest, North Carolina, if you're anywhere around, a good friend of mine, Ron Harris, who I talked to on the way over here, wrote a play, Etchings in Stone. It's a concept of you visiting the wall, which also will be in Wake Forest next week. But the concept is you, the visitor, are sitting inside the Vietnam Memorial Wall, and you're able, by magic of Ron Harris, you're able to hear the thoughts of people who visit the wall. So be sure to come and to the Renaissance Park. Give them a call, look them up online and give them a call. As of tonight, there was about 100 and some tickets left before they were sold out. And they're free. They just ask you to get tickets so we don't have more people that can go there. Also, the new wall that Hills, Traveling Wall, will be in Wake Forest on Thursday, October 18th, Friday the 19th, Saturday the 20th, and Sunday up until about 1:30 on the 21st. And the reason I say new, this wall is 3/4 size, 375 feet long. It also has a granite face to it. So when you go to DC, how you do the rubbings, you'll also be able to do the rubbings there. There'll be all kinds of displays and so forth there. It's open 24 hours a day. The opening ceremonies is Thursday at 4 o'clock. Come out, and after each night of Thursday night, Friday night, and Saturday night at 7 o'clock in the amphitheater there, the play again, or the drama, Etchings in Stone, will be shown free of charge. There, they do not have seats. It's kind of an open outdoor theater. So bring a chair, bring a blanket, spout and stretch out and enjoy the play, all done by by American Vietnam veterans and their families. Enjoy the show. It's been a long show. My brain's quit working. Thank y'all, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety. or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section at nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Telestream's Wirecast software, StreamingGear.com, Carolina Apparel, and DeltaForce.net.